more validating than you might think. I'll begin with the uncomfortable part first, because for some people, stepping away from social media didn't come from a place of perfect self-awareness or emotional balance. Something usually pushed them out. A breakup happened, or a phase of depression made the contrast between their real life and everyone else's highlight reel feel unbearable. Maybe they shared something real and were met with silence, or worse, misunderstood completely. And that kind of exposure, that vulnerability that wasn't received well, leaves something behind. It doesn't just disappear. For a lot of people, leaving wasn't a calm or carefully thought-out decision. It felt more like protecting themselves. And that matters to acknowledge, because the idea that private people are simply more evolved is a little too neat. Sometimes they're just people who got hurt by the system and chose not to return. That's a completely valid reason and a real experience. What becomes interesting is what happens afterward, because almost everyone describes a similar feeling a few weeks later, and you'll recognize it if it's you. Something inside gets quieter. It's not fear of missing out, it's closer to the opposite, like a constant background noise you didn't even realize was there suddenly disappears, and you notice what silence actually feels like again. And when you ask them what they miss about it, most pause for a long time, then usually say something like, "I don't really miss it at all." There's research that helps explain why that sense of quiet appears. A study in the Journal of Consumer Research found that when people expected to share an experience, even before they actually did, they enjoyed it less. Just the mental act of preparing to post pulls you slightly out of the moment. You're living it, but also framing it for an audience at the same time, and those two states compete with each other. The memory becomes thinner, and the emotional connection weakens. Private people, whether they knew about the study or not, felt that trade-off, and eventually decided it wasn't worth it. These are often the same people who were told they were strange or different, asked what they were hiding. There's a kind of automatic suspicion directed at anyone who doesn't participate in the visibility culture, as if choosing not to perform is somehow an admission of something. And for people who grew up hearing that, discovering that there's actual psychological reasoning behind how they feel hits differently than just being told they're right. The term most connected to this is private self-consciousness. It's the tendency to look inward, to focus on your own thoughts and feelings rather than constantly monitoring how you appear to others. People high in private self-consciousness aren't disconnected. They're actually more aware, just internally. They pay attention to what they genuinely feel instead of what they're expected to feel. They ask themselves, what do I really think about this, instead of how does this look to others? And in a world that's built around outward performance, that way of being can seem like a flaw. It isn't. What it builds over time, not instantly, is a sense of self that doesn't rely on external validation to stay steady. And that's rare, because most people are running a constant internal check. Are people responding to me? Do I look okay? Does my life seem normal? Private people, sometimes intentionally and sometimes out of necessity, turned that process down. There is a real social cost to that, and it's important to be honest about it. Not posting in a world centered on posting creates a certain kind of friction. You become harder to keep up with, and people who used to stay connected through your updates now have to actually reach out, and many of them don't. Some relationships slowly fade away simply because that easy connection point is gone. That can hurt. But what also tends to happen is that the people who do reach out, who text, call, and make plans, turn out to be a different kind of connection entirely. And the Harvard study of adult development, which followed people for over 80 years, consistently found that the quality of close relationships is one of the strongest predictors of long-term health and happiness. It's the depth, not the number. The friend who remembers small details months later, who checks in the next morning, that's what matters. That's what the data shows. There are generations, actually several, who remember life before all of this, before silence started to feel suspicious, and many of them described a similar feeling, that life felt more like it belonged to them, not perfect in every way, Technology absolutely has its place, but more theirs, like everyday experiences had a texture that didn't need to be documented to matter. That instinct to simply experience something without turning it into content is something younger generations now have to actively relearn. It doesn't come naturally anymore. And the people who never lost that instinct, or who found their way back to it, often describe a kind of presence in their daily life that's hard for others to explain. They're just there, fully in the moment. No part of them is already drafting a caption. People often call that peace, but it's more than that. It's ownership. The sense that your life is actually yours in a way that's difficult to explain to someone who's been sharing that ownership for years. So if you grew up thinking you were different for not wanting to share, if you stepped away and people assumed something was wrong, or if you've always felt like your life is yours in the way that social media quietly asks you to give up and you never fully could, you weren't behind. If anything, you were ahead of a conversation that people are only now beginning to understand. If any part of this connected with your experience of social media, share it with someone who might need it. And if you're someone who thinks deeply about these things, you'll probably find value in the other psychology videos on the screen now. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already so you don't miss what's next. And if you want to support more of these deep dives, you can also hit the join button. It genuinely helps keep this going.